Good afternoon, everyone. Is the mic working? Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for being a bit late. My name is Auguste Kwame. I'm Director for our Human Development and Economic Management Department in IEG. In the absence of our acting DG, I will make some brief remarks before we continue with the proceedings. Before I start, though, let me also wish a warm welcome to our speakers and guests whom you will be introduced to soon. As many of you know, in IAG, every year we produce our annual result and performance on the World Bank Group's report. We call it WRAP, for lack of a better name. And the main part of the report looks at the performance and result of the World Bank Group institutions, IDA, IBID, IFC, and MIGA. It provides management and the development community, including bank staff and stakeholders, insight on how the institutions are doing. We look at data from several years behind, so it gives a perspective on how the bank's performance is evolving over time. And when we do that, we also launch the WRAP. We do a main launch event, which this year happened in June. And we were lucky to have Kristalina, the CEO, joining our former DG, Caroline Hyder, I believe in this room, if my recollection is exact. And I recall Kristalina saying emphatically that the report is useful in helping bank group management do better as they try to do more with more resources. Today we're here to have a second event on the same WRAP because in each report we also have a thematic chapter in addition to the performance of the bank. So the thematic chapters looks at how the World Bank is addressing emerging issues in a given thematic area. And for the WRAP 17, the thematic chapter was on environmental sustainability. This came about because my understanding is that Jim Kim asked our former DG, Caroline Hyder, whether the bank portfolio is getting greener because he was very interested in that topic, as many in the global community are. So we take a lot of pride in having looked at this issue in the WRAP 2017, and we're here today to delve into this particular topic and share with you the findings embedded in the chapter on environmental sustainability of the WRAP. To do that, we'll be joined by an eminent panel of experts in the area from within the bank and from outside the bank. The panel will be moderated by my dear colleague and friend, Jose Carvalho, who is the department head for private sector finance and sustainable development. And the author of the WRAP chapter on the environmental sustainability sits in Jose's department. It's Stephen Hutton, who will lead us with a presentation on the main findings, the result, in order to tease out some questions and a good discussion from the panel. Jose will introduce panel members, so I will quickly hand over first to Stephen to make a presentation, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion led by Jose. So thank you very much, and we look forward to a good discussion. I should also mention that we have several colleagues connected by various means. I don't know whether it's all WhatsApp or WebEx or another W thing, but several colleagues are connected, I understand. So thank you very much for joining us online. And also I would like to acknowledge the excellent work done by our knowledge and communication team in IAG, led by Brenda Barbo, who is here. And this particular event has been organized by a group of colleagues, Tony and many others who are here. Sorry, I have no time to mention all the names, but they always do a good job making sure that our evaluations and our reports are adequately shared with you. So thank you very much to our knowledge and communication team. Thanks. So, Stephen, floor is yours.
Thanks, Auguste. Thanks to our panelists and audience, everyone here for joining us today. So I want to present some findings from work we've done as part of the results and performance of the World Bank Group report, which last year had a special topic on environmental sustainability. In particular, I want to talk about how the World Bank Group is supporting environmental sustainability through its projects. So, as Auguste mentioned, a couple of years ago, World Bank Group President Jim Kim was talking to our Vice President for Independent Evaluation, Caroline Hyder, and he said, "People keep telling me we're doing more on environment than we used to. Can you tell me if that's true?" So we went and found out, and the answer is yes, by about 4 percentage points. So I'm going to talk about how the project portfolio of the World Bank Group has changed over the last 10 years in terms of its support for environmental benefits, looking at the level, the composition, and the country location. So we talk a lot about environmental sustainability in our high-level corporate strategies. We are to achieve twin goals on poverty reduction and shared prosperity in a sustainable manner, including environment. The forward look emphasizes sustainability and resilience, including environment. We have a World Bank Group environment strategy, sustainability frameworks for IFC and MIGA, action plans on climate change and forests. And through many of these, we have emphasized the need to mainstream elements of environmental sustainability across the portfolio. But what are we actually doing in practice? So first, I want to talk about the level of support for potential environmental benefits. We carried out an analysis of a large sample of newly approved projects in 2 time periods covering a decade, and we identified potential environmental benefits based on the activities, the type of activities supported in those projects. So for the World Bank, IDA and IBRD, plus some trust funds, we saw a 4 percentage point increase in the share of project components with potential environmental benefits, from 33 to 37% between 2008 to 10 versus 2015 to 17. That's the two, the orange and then the blue bar on the left. For IFC, and I caution that these numbers are not directly comparable to the World Bank, because here we looked at projects rather than project components, a more detailed analysis. We also saw a 4 percentage point increase in potential environmental benefits, from 31 to 35%. And for MIGA, we saw a large increase in its share of projects with potential environmental benefits, but starting from a low base. We also looked then at the type of environmental benefits being supported. So the World Bank Group's environment strategy talks about environment in terms of clean, meaning climate change mitigation and pollution abatement, green, meaning sustainable management of natural resources, and resilient, including resilience to climate shocks and disaster risk management. So we use that framework. This slide has the breakdown for the World Bank. Looking at the leftmost part of the graph, we can see clean has increased from 19 to 22% of the portfolio. This has been driven largely by increases in support for climate change mitigation, particularly in renewable energy. Support for energy efficiency has declined, and support for pollution abatement has been flat, as documented in detail in a separate IEG evaluation on pollution. For green, there has been an overall decrease in support, from 13 to 10%. Increases in support for management of forests and fisheries have been smaller than declines in support for biodiversity conservation, water resource management, and irrigation efficiency improvements. The largest change has been a doubling in support for resilient benefits, from 5 to 10%, including support for infrastructure and for institutional reform and capacity building. For IFC, the composition hasn't changed as much over time. Most of the support has been for climate change mitigation, renewable energy and energy efficiency, and water pollution abatement through wastewater treatment. There have also been green benefits in agribusiness and forestry, and engagement on sustainable supply chains and sustainable products. MIGA projects have also concentrated on clean benefits. So the main story across the whole World Bank Group is an increase in climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, where there have been high-level corporate priorities, specific targets, but a decrease in support for some other types of environmental benefits. In what countries has the World Bank, and the slide focuses on the World Bank, provided this environmental support? So more projects with environmental benefits are in higher income countries than lower income, and this gap has been widening over time. Upper middle income countries increased their support for environmental benefits by 8 percentage points, low income countries only by 1 percentage point. Low income countries have increased support for climate change mitigation and in particular climate resilience, but have decreased support for other environmental benefits. Our largest client countries are also overrepresented in their share of environment support as compared to smaller and medium-sized client countries, which are underrepresented. The 10 largest borrowers by volume, borrower countries by volume, had roughly 1/3 of all of the project components, but half of the project components with environmental benefits. So based on these findings, I want to leave you with 3 messages and 3 questions to think about. The first message is that all 3 institutions of the World Bank Group have increased their support for environmental sustainability. For the World Bank and IFC, both by 4 percentage points. In the report, we asked, is this enough? We didn't draw a conclusion. We posed this question back in June when we launched this to the World Bank Group CEO, Kristalina Georgieva, and she had a simple answer. Clearly, given that we have only one small planet, the answer is no, and we have to strive to do more. So my question for today is, what would it take to do more? How can the bank group continue to mainstream environmental sustainability into its existing work and continue business development in areas with environmental benefits? The second message is that the composition of activities has changed. We're doing more on climate change mitigation and much more on climate adaptation, but the same or even less on some other environmental challenges. The World Bank Group has committed already to go further on climate action, and this addresses a critical development challenge. But what about the rest, the parts of environment not directly linked to climate? On biodiversity conservation, natural resource management, water, land, and others. Has the international attention to climate change meant less space for the rest of the environment agenda? How do we make an economic case for biodiversity? Do we need to engage more on this beyond protected areas? What are the best opportunities for activities that have both climate change benefits and other environmental benefits? The third message is about where we're doing this work on environment, increasingly in upper middle income countries and in the World Bank's largest clients. Is this the right choice? Low-income countries have many competing development priorities, but also face high vulnerability. Smaller countries may have room in their portfolio for only a few priorities. When should environment be one of them? If the World Bank Group were to try to do more on environment in these countries, how should we go about that? What does it take to convince government decision makers that environment should be a priority? If you have questions about the report, you can find it on our website. You can reach out to us in person or online. With that, I'd like to hand over to Jose Carbajo Martinez, Director for IEG in IEG for the Financial, Private Sector, and Sustainable Development Department. He'll introduce our panel and moderate our discussion. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you for my colleagues for the introductions and the nice summary, Stephen, of the results and the findings of our important evaluation. Now comes the fun part, what we're going to discuss. With this wonderful set of panelists, where do we go from here and how do we address the questions, the challenging questions that Stephen has put on the table? So the way we're going to proceed is the following. I'm going to introduce one by one the panelists, and then we'll ask a first question for them to express their views about these findings. And then we will follow that with other questions from the audience and other questions that might come across as we proceed. First, let me start with you, Julia. Julia Bucknell is Director of Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice, sitting here in the middle of the panel. She has worked practically in every region of the World Bank on operations and knowledge issues relating to the environment, water resources, climate change, and energy. So she's really very well equipped to be in this panel, certainly. She is the lead author of a flagship publication on water in the Middle East entitled Making the Most of Scarcity, and was a core team member for the 2010 World Development Report on Climate Change. With that introduction and what we have heard before, Julia, so what would it take for the bank to do more on environment?
All right, thanks. I probably should update my bio, huh? Nice to be here, and thanks a lot. So, I mean, I think this is an existential question for the bank. I think it's an existential question for our clients. And I do feel like the future of the bank should depend on us doing more on global and regional issues, on public goods issues, because that's an area where there are few institutions that can help. There are some things that we do that I would argue that there are other institutions can do them. If we're positioning ourselves for the next 50 years of the bank, I would argue that public goods and environmental issues and sustainability issues would be part of them. The second point is for our clients. I mean, a world of 9 billion people with climate change is going to need a lot more effort to make things sustainable. And I don't think that our country programs, I don't think our clients are really doing that. Again, I still think we're still building things that were a really good idea in 1975. I'm not sure, I mean, they're still a good idea, but the importance of sustainability is much higher relative to those things now than it was in 1975. Talking of 1975, since then, the world has lost nearly 50% of its biodiversity from what we understand. I mean, we have crises of sustainability beyond the climate change ones that are, you know, in the news and that we kind of know about. We have these other ones, and we don't even really know what the implications of that are. And when we're losing forests, I mean, I'm sure Paula sitting there can tell us the amount of forests we're losing every day. We have crises. We have health crises. I mean, 15 times more people die as a result of pollution than die from war and terrorism. And yet, the amount of effort that we put into reducing that, I suspect, is significantly lower. So, your question of what it would take, it takes a few things. I mean, at the bank level and at the country level, it takes a kind of vision and determination. I want to give one example of the country of Pakistan, the country strategy of Pakistan. The country director has challenged every single team to do something about plastics. And so every single team, the transport, the health, everybody has to do something about plastics. And then the own office has also phased out single-use plastics. So you can have a vision, you can spread these things through all of the units, all of the activities. But it takes determination, and no country team can focus on more than one or two things, right? So they have to decide. I'm not suggesting every country is going to be able to or want to do that, but I think there are some. I think the just launched environmental and social framework should give us a huge opportunity to improve sustainability of projects across the entire scope of what we do. If we implement that properly, it will go from being a thing that stops us doing harm to a thing that actually changes the development objective of everything that we're trying to do, if we do it properly, if we do it well, with judgment and wisdom and consideration. I think that's a huge opportunity. And I think there are also some nitty-gritty things that we can do to improve things. I mean, one of the reasons that green has gone down is because our standard indicators don't catch things properly. So I think we can work much. It's hard to aggregate some of these environmental things. So we have indicators at a much lower level than the thing that we're trying to do. So we miss some of the great things that we're doing in those figures, partly because we're not properly measuring them. So I think we have to work at the really big picture, the middle picture, the operational side, and on the really nitty-gritty things in order to do this. I do think it's the most important thing we can do.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this opening, almost programmatic approach. You know, vision and determination, better use of standards and measurement to improve our knowledge. But you have mentioned something that is quite, it gives me the bridge for introducing the next panel member, and that is the importance of clients. So when we produce evaluation reports, we tend to pin down management and say, you're not doing enough. And then they come back and say, well, you know, we have to take into account what is the client demand for this. And for that, I'm going to introduce my net. To address that point, I'm going to introduce our next guest, Mr. Fernando José Gómez, Director of Green Growth Mission, the Republic of Colombia. Fernando was appointed the head of the Green Growth Technical Mission for the National Planning Department in June 2016. He's an experienced leader in both public and private sectors. He has broad knowledge of trade, green growth, and competitiveness. He started his career as a macroeconomist, perhaps, in the Central Bank of Colombia, and then became a member of his board of directors. He has had other responsibilities in other ministries. And while working for the private sector, Fernando organized and was the first president of the Private Competitiveness Council. So, Fernando, what does it take for a client government to establish a project, an environmentally sustainable project, with the World Bank or other IFIs?
Okay. Thank you, Jose, and thank you for this invitation to participate today in this event. First of all, I will ask your indulgence with my English. So it's not my native language and not my official working language, so I'll do my best. I think there are three main reasons why there is a low demand for environmental impact loans from developing countries. The first of them is the lack of weight in the cabinet of environmental authorities. No? So the authorities are new, they're young, they have insufficient budgets, they are very much focused on adopting new regulations, in subscribing international agreements. They are trying to do their best to implement these regulations and laws in the provinces, in the territories, with very limited capacity to do outreach in the rural areas. So in general, they are very limited in their governance and their capacity to act. And in that respect, in the view of the finance minister and the economic ministers, they are viewed as somebody as a sector that just requesting resources, requesting funds, and they have many other requests. And other requests, like from the people that are in charge of roads or airports or education areas, where they can do a much better job doing their case in terms of, hey, I need these resources, but I can pay back the economy in a very short term if you allocate these resources to my sector. So in that sense, the environmental sector has to start looking at low-hanging fruits and to try to do some strategies to be seen inside their governments, not only as a sector that demands resources, but also that can be able to generate income to the country. In that sense, I think that Costa Rica is a good example. Costa Rica right now has a very strong strategy for their ecotourism, have a very strong strategy to bring in all the bird watchers of the world, that are several millions. And in that sense, right now, I suppose that the environmental minister in Costa Rica has a lot of negotiating capacity inside the cabinet, no? Because he's generating a lot of resources for the country. So that would be my first argument. The second argument is that, and it's related to the first one, is that there are very few well-structured projects. No? So if in general in developing countries we have very few well-structured projects for roads or for what other infrastructure, even we will have them even less for environmental projects. So in that sense, we will have to start looking to alternatives. And I found out that there's a nice line of loans in the Inter-American Development Bank for structuring and designing new projects that become non-refundable if this project is finally becomes a loan to develop the project with the IDB. So in that sense, I think that could be one strategy that to facilitate countries to structure new projects and have them encourage them to get the new loans, making these small loans, these initial small loans, non-refundable. And a third reason that I think that there is low demand for this type of loans, for environmental loans, or with an impact on the environment, is that there are few existence and low governance on environmental public policy instruments. So what do I refer to? What I am referring to? Most environmental costs come from negative externalities. We know them, and we need to make them visible and to make people pay for these externalities. But we need appropriate instruments that are also applicable in the economic policy, the politics of these economic policies is not easy in our countries. So, for example, I would make an example in Colombia. In the last 2 years ago, we were able to, through the fiscal reform, to introduce the carbon taxes, to introduce a small tax on single-use plastic bags, to introduce also payments for environmental services for farmers, so that all those are new instruments that are now in place. And as soon as the public finance minister saw that the carbon tax generated $500 million the first year, the environment minister got his attention. No? Now he can get an appointment not in 2 months, but in 1 week. No? So that changes a lot the type of interrelation between the environmental minister and the other key ministers. So in that sense, I think that these new public policy instruments are key really to increase the perceived and effective return of all these projects. No? So I would just stop here for now, and I think will be 3 main reasons why we don't have enough demand for these environmental loans from the IFC.
Thank you, Fernando. I think that we are following the golden rule where every speaker talks about 3 points. You know? So they talk about 3 points. Let's see whether Tomas, my next speaker, can keep it up. So, Fernando, you did raise issues that are very important for us, for the World Bank Group, because really at the heart of one of your messages is the opportunity cost of public resources. And that's where the private sector comes into play, and it's at the heart of the maximized finance for development, cascade approach, and what have you. So it's very, very good bridge to introduce my next speaker, Tomas Stelman, who is Senior Director, he's sitting at the end, Senior Director of Manufacturing, Agribusiness and Services at the IFC. He previously was Director of Manufacturing, the same, but as a Regional Director of Europe and Central Asia. That is correct? Good. Thomas has been in IFC since 1995, so he has some experience on his back. And before joining IFC, he worked for Flank Econ, which is a private US-based consultant and investment advisory firm focusing on Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So, having heard, the programmatic approach of doing more and what are the constraints and trade-offs that client countries face, Thomas, what kind of investments, related to private sector development, should IFC support to increase it with environmental benefits? Thank you.
So thank you, Jose. Yeah, I need to update parts of that CV as well, right? So we don't have to talk about things from 23 years ago. But seriously, thanks for having me. I think it's an honor and frankly a very consistent story and messaging with what you heard from other speakers. I would point out one point that did not come across in Stephen's presentation when we talk about the 4% increase within IFC. The department that I'm responsible for, Manufacturing Agribusiness Services, actually had a very significant increase during that period. If you remember, in terms of number of projects with this high potential environmental benefit that comes out of them. So for us, whether it's agribusiness or parts of services or even within manufacturing, clearly the focus on environmental sustainability is a big part of the business. Now, I want to build on something that Fernando had said, because clearly at the core of what we do is what the clients want to do. So ultimately, the business and the impact of IFC is our clients and working with our clients to achieve various kinds of objectives. Some of it is financial, some of it is developmental. Clearly, environment and social aspects and objectives are at the core of it. But ultimately, the clients do things because either it makes financial sense or because of compliance reasons. So to the extent we can customize our offering and work with product design and project design in a way that helps the clients achieve the environmental and social objectives of environmental sustainability in a way that makes financial sense and it helps them become compliant. Clearly, it's key to our success in this space. It happens through performance standards. making sure that our clients follow that. It happens through engagement on advisory front and making sure that sometimes we bundle properly in investment and advisory products, and sometimes it also happens through simply making sure that the clients do as they say and then implement the projects the way we expect them to do from the standpoint of impact. Clearly, there is this whole notion of how much we focus on climate change, and came across in the findings of the report very clearly, versus other environmental sustainability objectives. For us, sometimes the separation of the two is not so easy, and maybe it's a matter of tagging, and maybe it's a matter of how we actually look at projects. We try to look at them in a fairly comprehensive way, but there are many projects that we would see in a climate space that have significant, enormous environmental benefit beyond what's purely in a clean column. And I think that's something that clearly from the perspective of the industries that I cover, it's fundamental. Now, going forward, what types of things we should be expecting to do more to go beyond climate? I think that's one of the messages that comes out of the report, to focus on this. Climate smart agribusiness, agriculture. This is a very wide range of things, and maybe that will come up a little bit more in detail in the discussion, but matters related to precision farming, you kind of alluded to that already, how you use chemicals, how you use pesticides, how you use fertilizer in a way that does not destroy or hurt the environment. It's a subject of food waste, which apparently amounts to about 30% of food that's being produced around the world. How do you deal with that? The climate impact of the waste versus what's smart in terms of how things are being utilized. Fertilizer production, so fertilizer production and application, to what extent you can actually work with companies in that business to work with their farmer clients to apply things in a smart way, in a way that does not harm the environment. So there's a whole compendium of different types of things. And matters such as green buildings, which for us as IFC has grown quite a bit. And green buildings can mean any number of things, focus on energy consumption for sure, but it's also water, it's other materials. How do you reduce the environmental footprint of what we do in
do you have an example space of a recent project that IFC has completed in any of these areas?
So to give you a sense, there's a company in China called Syngenta, which is a fertilizer company, which actually is building a significant network of basically extension services with the farmers of how to teach them to apply fertilizer in a way that is smart, prudent, cost-effective, but also very good for the environment. So that's one specific example. There's a company called Tupras, which is a refinery in Turkey, and basically a project that might get in some ways branded as a climate change focused project, was really about installation of sulfur dioxide treatment equipment that reduced the emissions. So going back to the pollution kind of column of things in a very significant way, bringing it to a completely different level in terms of compliance with standards. So working with our standards in order to bring the companies closer to where you want them in terms of environmental sustainability. And there are many. We can go through
Thank you very much, Thomas. So it's two things. One is the standards, the compliance, but also the selection and the strategic targeting of certain sectors that you think has more environmental.
Yes, and keeping in mind that at the core of it is the client. IFC works with the private sector, so the client needs to be willing to do certain things, and it could be driven by financial considerations, could be driven by compliance. How do we marry the two in a way that actually makes also business sense?
Very good. Thank you very much. So that brings me to our last, but not by any means least, speaker. You've heard this expression of keep your friends closer, but your critics even closer, right? So this is why we have the representative of the World Resources Institute, our external former World Bank employee, I understand, if this bio is updated. I have developed this hypothesis that the people who work inside the bank don't update their bios, so there might be something to do with job security. Anyway, So Manish Bapna, thank you for being here. He oversees the WRI programs and chairs his management team and working to strengthen the impact of the World Resources Institute research. He has led the effort to establish offices in China, India, and Brazil, and has helped launch programs on cities, energy, finance, and adaptation. I think, Manish, before you were a World Bank employee as well, right? Where you were working in watershed? Okay. I've only joined 2 years ago, that's why I don't remember you. Manish, thank you for being here again. What do you make of all of this? What the role, with your perspective from a former, one of us, and now as an outsider, so to speak, what role should the World Bank play to move the environmental agenda forward?
Thank you, Jose. And it's great to be here. I was at the bank for about 10 years, came in around the mid-90s, worked on rural development issues, infrastructure issues, East Asia, South Asia, a bit in Latin America, but left, actually, and have spent the last 15 years kind of outside of the bank, most recently with the World Resources Institute for the past 10 years. So there's so much to be said. So I'm going to be fairly succinct and come back in on a few points. So first, the urgency of the issue, right? The science is absolutely clear. The trend lines are moving in the wrong direction, right? This is an existential issue. Julia is absolutely right? We're on with optimistic assumptions, we're on a 3.5-degree pathway, right? Tropical forest loss is increasing. Baseline water stress is getting worse. Air pollution will be, of the 169 SDG targets, air pollution is going to be the one that is most off track. Biodiversity loss, we know what's happening, right? So the science is clear, and I want to really pick up on, Tomas, your point, compartmentalizing climate versus forest versus water versus, these are so tightly integrated. You're absolutely right. That was one of the big things about the Sustainable Development Goals, is how they brought them together in a more, to understand the synergies and trade-offs, but to understand that you need to look at them as a system. So really important point. How many of you know, familiar with the World Economic Forum does an annual survey that they release on risk, on global risks, right? 1,000 CEOs, finance ministers, economic ministers, and so forth. And if you look over the past 10 years at the global risks that they consider to be most significant and most likely, so kind of likelihood and significance, you look over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, maybe water was on that list of the top 5 or 10. Now, they're all virtually environmental climate issues. It's about water, it's about adaptation, it's about extreme weather. It is all. So this issue, that science, has led to incredible awareness in a way that I don't think we have fully appreciated how quickly, aside from a few blocks away, the recognition that science matters, and it's leading to a much greater awareness about the relevance and the significance of these risks. So point one. Point two is that the economics is becoming increasingly persuasive. 10 years ago, the conversation was, you could either focus on growth and jobs, or you could focus on the environment and climate action. 5 years ago, we worked with a number of others. We set up a commission called the Global Commission on Economy and Climate. It was headed by Calderon, Felipe Calderon, the former president of Mexico. Colombia was one of the sponsoring countries. Ngozi from the bank was one of the co-chairs. Paul Pullman was one of the co-chairs. Nick Stern was one of the co-chairs. Kristallina's on the commission. Kayo Kochweiser's on the commission. Sri Mulyani's on the commission. So all the past managing directors of the bank, right? And what they came out with 5 years ago was actually, it was a false choice, right? These issues could be compatible. They're aligned. You don't have to choose between taking action on the climate and the environment or taking action on growth and jobs. Just last month, we delivered this report by the same commission to Gutierrez in New York a couple weeks ago. And the narrative now is that these are inextricably linked. You cannot have a low-carbon climate, you cannot tackle climate without thinking about growth. You cannot actually sustain growth without taking into account climate and sustainability. The narrative is that the growth story of this century must be an inclusive and low-carbon story. We did some modeling. We looked at if you were to take decisive action on climate, what would that mean in terms of growth, right? What we came up with, and these are conservative results, $26 trillion of economic benefits between 2018 and 2030, globally, cumulatively, if we were to take a decisive step towards climate action, right? And that takes into, or in addition, we quantified jobs, improvements or reductions in mortality, morbidity because of improvements in air quality. We looked at what the revenue that would be generated to governments, the example that you gave about carbon pricing. It is an incredibly persuasive story. And I think the question and the role for part of the bank is how do we get that out? So the economics to me is increasingly persuasive. Nick Stern would say, if you asked him, what would you do, what did you get wrong from your report 10 years ago on the cost of climate action, he would say, I underestimated the benefits of action, and I seriously underestimated the costs of inaction, right? So the economics are clear. So what does that mean now for the bank? I mean, I think this report that IEG came out with is great, but it really is good, but I think it's very modest compared to what the actual challenge is before us, right? President Eisenhower once said, if you have to solve a tough problem, you don't break it up into small pieces, you expand the boundaries to come up with the solution. So my just kind of very high level kind of 4 points. First, on the green, on the clean, on the resilient, there is much more the bank can do, and we can get into the details of how to reignite kind of lending on water, how to get serious about biodiversity. So kind of point one is within the 38%, how do you push that forward? Second point, you can't just look at the 38% or whatever the share is. What's the rest of the portfolio doing? We have done some research looking at energy supply within the bank and IFC, looking not just at what is in that 38%, but what is the 62%? And is that Paris compatible? Is that sustainable, right? Third, it's clearly not just lending. It's also the research, the analytical work, the policy engagement. Hugely important, right? And fourth, it's not even what the World Bank does through its actual operations, right? There are much bigger flows, and the bank is uniquely positioned to help shape and influence those flows. The big question right now on this agenda is in no small part Belt and Road Initiative. What will China do and other financiers in this massive infrastructure play in Africa and Latin America, in Europe, the rest of Asia? How will we ensure, and we just put out some research on this, how will we ensure that does not remain traditional infrastructure investments, but become something that is compatible? And the bank is uniquely positioned to help shape those flows. So I'll stop there, we can get into details there. Delighted to be here.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and deep thoughts here. You broke the golden rule of 3. You talked about 4 points, but given that you are our external guest, I'll allow that. No, this is extremely useful. Now, the question is, part of this, part of your comments are solutions. Part of them are sort of, agendas to develop further. So we need to keep on that. Now, I was tempted to give the floor now to the audience, but I want to ask a cross-cutting question. And to the extent that you can provide example, that will be very helpful. So one of the findings is that there is a lot of potential. So one of the findings of this report is that perhaps the World Bank group is going in the direction of putting too much emphasis on climate change and overshadowing a little bit of the many environmental challenges. But yet it says that you have potential to do projects that combine both, that you improve environmental benefits in other areas and you also adapting and mitigating climate change, the so-called co-benefits. Can you give us, from your own expertise, whether country, environment sector, etc., private sector, examples of projects or approaches, policy instruments where you are promoting these two, that you can achieve co-benefits? You can start if you want.
Sure. I think that
Sorry, not only examples, but examples where the World Bank Group could do more. That's,
Okay.
that's my...
Take biodiversity, right? Much of the work, what the World Bank does, it'll kind of get some concessional funding from the Jefferson Trust Fund, do some work around protected areas. I don't even know how much. I used to work on this 15, 20 years ago. I don't know how much active work the bank is doing on protected areas. But if you really want to look at biodiversity, look at what some of the key drivers are, right? One of the big things is the agricultural frontier. Look at commodities, soya, cocoa, palm oil, right? How do you stem that, right? Look at deforestation-free supply chains where the IFC is involved. You look at how you actually restore degraded lands in order to avoid having to intrude into forested areas. There is so much that the bank can do more of that would address the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss, but do so in ways that have massive climate implications. So you take something like restoration, you build resilience, and you sequester carbon, right? Natural climate solutions are seen as about 35% of the climate solution by 2030, yet the amount of money both at the bank and the world is putting into that space is a small fraction of what is needed. So this co-benefit argument that many people have alluded to is real. And I think to some extent, we have to see climate as a co-benefit in many countries, but there are a lot of other things that are more pressing or seen as more prominent that we can create a narrative around, but that have major climate co-benefits.
I won't talk more. I was going to talk about forests too. Forests are 30% of the climate solution and 3% of the climate finance. Just let that sink in for 5 minutes. I don't think I need to say any more. And we all know the benefits that forests have on watersheds, on biodiversity, on indigenous people, I mean not on, but for indigenous people. So they have huge amounts of other benefits. So I think that's one clear example. But I think the co-benefits thing is a little bit of a false hope in some cases. I think urban air pollution is better served by focusing on urban air pollution than on saying, let's do climate and then hope we get a little bit of climate, The children in poor countries are dying of non-climate pollution, and those are the ones that we need to be focused on, and then say there are going to be some climate benefits to that, so we can have co-benefits in the other direction. But I mean, 1 in 10 people dying of pollution is a huge thing and needs to be tackled on its own. It doesn't need to be a kind of additional benefit on the side of some other objective, I think. There you go.
Well, that's a very good point, and indeed the IG report that looked at that realized that we have been going down in terms of the shares and the resources allocated to local pollution. That's a good point.
Okay, I will start saying I completely agree with Julia on her point, because we are seeing that in Medellin, in Bogota, every day. No? There's huge cities, 5 million population cities, and a lot of pollution by public transportation, by private transportation, and basically nothing is being done about it. No? And being not even trying to get getting older vehicles out of circulation. That not even those kind of basic actions are being taken right now. I would just want to add to this. We recently finished our green growth technical mission. I should say with a wonderful support from the bank, both technical and funding. That we are very thankful about that. And we found out, we were a little bit surprised because we found out that at the beginning, we would say, people would be saying to us, well, there's a lot of trade-offs between economic growth, social well-being, and environmental activities, and in that regard, what we saw after doing all this work these 2 years is that there's a lot of complementarity. It's not only substitution, but a lot of complementarity. And just to illustrate this, in our case, for example, the new economic opportunities that arises from green growth are incredible. Right? For a country like Colombia, in the tropics, we have a great generation of biomass that can be used in economic profitable ways. Also, we have all the opportunities that the bioeconomy opens thanks to our biodiversity. So there are a lot of business models that are feasible, that what they need is a little bit of capital, that what they need is a little bit of visibility with the local business community, because there's a lot of to be done in terms of educational efforts with our business communities, just to show them all the opportunities that they are missing because of lack of understanding. Also, we have seen that for small and medium-sized enterprises, the inefficiency with which they use natural resources, energy, water, land, that if they could have better technological packages, they could save a lot of money, in what they are paying right now for those resources, and with a great benefit to the environment. So in those terms, I would say that there are a lot of things that can be done in terms of generating more prosperity, generating more income, employment, and at the same time protecting the environment. I would just want to add that for the World Bank, there are two sources of great opportunity also to generate more demand for environmental loans that are obviously the Paris Agreement and in the Sustainability Development Goals, the SDGs. All developing countries subscribe to them. No, most of our middle-income countries have commitments of reduction on greenhouse emissions, and we don't know how to do that. No? We have to really structure a strategy, structure our national mitigation actions, and there the bank can play a very important advisory role, and after that, generating a lot of needs of projects and programs that obviously have to be funded. So I think that there is a big space for IFIs to cover those needs of developing countries.
Thank you, Fernando. Thomas,
thank you. Thank you. I have an example. I agree with the forestry example, but frankly, for a number of years, IFC has really been diminishing its participation in that space. Hopefully to be reversed, but not an easy sector for lots of reasons, and maybe that will even come up also because of the environmental expectations of the world in that area. The example I have, which is very cross-cutting, and which is something that already has started happening in some of the more advanced countries where we operate, so, in part probably explains some of the charts that you were talking about, the focus on the kind of more energy kind of inefficient and at the same time higher income countries in the work is around cities. So building again a little bit on your example of what you remember about Bogota, the cities platform that we've been trying to work on across the bank group, but certainly from the IFC perspective, it's something that certainly focuses on energy use. So the first column very clearly, but then also pollution of all kinds of things. Certainly the use of resources. Ultimately, potentially the resilience of some of the cities, given where the poor of the world live, given how fast the level of urbanization is increasing in much of the countries which we cover. Clearly, it's something that it's both a challenge and an opportunity for the bank group in terms of having the policy focus work and project finance and transactions come together in a true public-private partnership way because of the fiscal constraints of many of the countries they are facing. Yeah, maybe we focused on ECA in Europe, Central Asia in the beginning. We focused more on LAC in the beginning of developing that platform, but ultimately it's about Southeast Asia, it's about Africa, about many urban concentrations that will have to be addressed in one way or another, and that is cross-cutting.
That's definitely a very good point, because many of you explicitly or implicitly have been naming cities and giving examples of that, and obviously the urban agenda cuts across these environmental challenges very, very rightly so. Now the time that you were waiting for, we're going to open the floor to the audience. If you want to address your questions, if you can approach the microphone, which is in the middle of the aisle, and introduce yourselves. And then ask the question and say whether the question is to a specific panel member or to all of them. Please do so. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi, thanks. I'm silent is what I am.
Wait a second. Help is on its way.
Just a matter of turning it on.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so I'm Agi Kiss. I'm with the Environment and Social team in OPCS. And I will be brief, but I have the magic 3. First of
Good.
all, how can we do more? One thing that unfortunately is working against us is this constant push towards shorter preparation times and larger projects. Those do not lend themselves to the kinds of environmental and social activities that we're all saying that we should be financing more of. It takes time to actually understand the environmental and social context. In terms of, I completely agree with Julia about the global public goods and the existential question. I just wonder whether the bank is ready to set targets around this. If we don't have targets, we're not going to do it. That's very clear. So we can, say over and over again how good it is. But we need actual targets that are linked to performance evaluations, quite frankly. Third, in terms of the clients, of course, as an environmental specialist, I love to see support going to environmental ministries, but I think that, that's not the whole game, obviously. And I always remember being in an African country that's very water scarce, talking about a water sector strategy with the water ministry and asking, in the discussion it came up, what is the purpose of this ministry? And the ministry saw itself as their purpose, their vision was to deliver water to users, as opposed to managing the country's scarcest and most important resource. So we have to work on, not just the environment ministries, but everybody who's actually managing these resources. And then I'm just going to quickly squeeze in one fourth one, which is to ask whether those water boxes, which can only be recycled at special facilities, are in fact being recycled at special facilities. I don't see any collection mechanism that will allow it.
So thank you very much. This has been a mix of feedback, questions, and your own personal view. Let's take another question, and then we go around. Would you please introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, Jeff Gibson, ENR. Galileo said that we need to measure what is measurable, and then make measurable what is not. So my question to you is, how do we measure environmental sustainability? We have this co-benefits thing in climate, and the SDGs have their 169 targets and 230 odd indicators, but I'm not sure if we've really settled on how we can measure environmental sustainability in an output-based method, not inputs, and something that's more ex post rather than ex ante. So my question is, if you had to pick 3 indicators, how would you measure environmental sustainability? And then, does it make sense, this is my second question, to have a country-level ranking, like a doing business for environmental sustainability? And if we were to do something like that, would it make sense to mirror Jim Kim's Human Capital Index, which kind of looks at the productivity cost of human capital? So, how many lives are lost or productivity lost from pollution? Would that make sense? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we have targets or no targets to promote, to incentivize performance. We have the political economy around, environmental ministers or, decision makers versus central government. And we have something that looks a bit like a, PhD proposal. How do we measure? Part of it is a PhD proposal. How do you measure environmental sustainability? Very, very good question, very profound. But the other one is, what are the indicators? I think indicators, Julia, you were mentioning before as well, the need to improve our knowledge and performance indicators in this area. So please, go ahead. If you want to start, Julia.
All right. Thanks. So I think the targets issue is interesting, isn't it? Because we do actually have tons of targets. Sustainable energy for all, sustainable education for all. I mean, we have tons of those things, and the SDGs already exist. I think maybe another, so yes, it's a good idea, it would be great. And there's a fundamental problem with our business model, which is, of course, domestic. I mean, it's national. So you can't set targets at the country level, which is where we do all of our planning and resource allocation. I think some of the new initiatives of having a specific block for certain things, you could imagine more things like that. We have a refugee window. Could we have a forest window, for example? I think that might be an easier and more operational thing. It's an idea. the issue of the measurement is a fundamental problem. It's always going to be difficult, and it's difficult to aggregate. There have been many PhDs on the topic already, even on defining what the damn thing means, never mind how to measure it. So I'm not going to try and answer that question, but I do think a doing business for sustainability is doable. I mean, we have the Wealth of Nations database, and that is something that we're looking at how feasible it may be, how much it would cost. You know, you can't start one of these things unless you're willing to go on for it for 20 years, right? And so it's not a small decision, but it is something that we're thinking about.
Anyone else?
Maybe just a very quick reaction. You know, certainly on targets. I think we all know what happened and how we pivot in a way when the climate targets had come up within a World Bank group and a really broader community. So clearly this is something that galvanizes resources, galvanizes attention. I agree we don't want to have too many of those, but you know, every now and then having a priority around something and having a specific target, you know, big challenge to define it. I'm not even going to, you know, step into this, but that would certainly change the attitudes and maybe remove some of that blurriness among the different objectives, right? That we kind of struggle with. And then on the ranking of countries, I tend to agree. Again, you know, we know what happened with the doing business ranking over the past 20 years, and then how important it became for policymakers to apply things in practice. Now, we could do this around sustainability, but we have to keep in mind that for an annual ranking to be valid, you know, some policy changes need to bring those kind of short-term results. And, you know, we're talking with a medium-term kind of at best. And how do you actually rank one another in between different elections that our governments have to follow and actually make policy changes that result in the changes in ranking? It's not as simple in a way as doing business.
Thank you, Tomas.
I think we have to remember that indexes are not just means and not ends in themselves. And in my previous life in the competitiveness area, I have to admit that sometimes in the government we would sit down and say, okay, how are we going to improve this year in the index, and what is the most effective way to do it? And basically we were trying to, deep down, what we were doing was manipulating the index, because we were just making the changes that were enough to get better position in the index. So we have to avoid having falling in this trap if we decide to have an environmental sustainability index. As I think it's a good idea, but in general, what you can do in the environment has a lag of time in terms of its impact. And so basically, I would say it would be nice to measure that index every 3 years or 5 years, something like that, just to make a change. Another point is that having targets is important, but it's very important to make these targets really visible, no? And in terms of and I have been in the government many times, and when there is an international conference organized by the World Bank about the next year, about what have you been doing, whatever, in terms of environmental targets, for example, then obviously the presidents will say, okay, what are we doing? No, what I'm going to present there? What results? So in those terms, having this international visibility really moves many countries, just even because they don't want to look bad in the international arena. So that's something you have to, as Mark said, you have to use all the means to have a good todas las medios de lucha. How do you say that in English? All the means of struggle, exactly. So one of those are, you're going to look bad if you're not doing this kind of sustainability policies. So probably you can do that, something on that. And also, I would say that the SDGs are going to be very important in terms of all these 169 goals that we have there. They are sufficiently multiple in many areas, and what we are thinking in Colombia is to assign them to each ministry and to each agency. No, not the 169 are not going to be responsibility in general of the government, but these 10 are going to be the responsibility of the of the water department, these others are of the agriculture department, etc., etc. And in that way, people are going to become accountable for a certain number of them. So I think that could be a way to go in terms of having the SDG really having a big impact in terms of sustainability policies.
Thank you, Fernando. Manish, would you like to add?
I mean,
Yep. So, go ahead. Next set of three questions. You introduce yourself, and you can, keep your question pointed and specific. Thank you.
I'll try.
Thank you.
My name is Saliha Dabarzik. I'm with the Adaptation Fund. I'm actually kind of curious how many people know about the Adaptation Fund, have heard of it? Okay, that's not so bad. Thank you. Very illuminating discussion. I really appreciate your interventions. And it got me kind of thinking, given that where the World Bank Group is now, and in this moment of time, where the geopolitical landscape is a bit rockier than what we've been used to for decades before, I would say. Just sort of on this, which is really a global issue, environmental problems don't necessarily follow national borders and boundaries. Given where we are and given the multilateral approach in which we work, and I've heard a lot about the SDGs, and we've heard about the connection between science and actually the limits to science when a government chooses to disregard it. And also the World Economic Forum risks, which again, although they have been steadily over the years incorporating more of or highlighting more of the clearly environmental risks in recent years, I've been seeing cybersecurity risks or geopolitical tensions. Those kinds of risks did not feature as prominently, I would say, 3 or 4 years ago, but in the last year, 2 years ago, that they start coming up. So my question, very pointed.
Thank you. we are here now.
We're taking our instructions from above, but what can we do to influence the discussion? What is it that the World Bank Group can do to bring action and re-energize the champions, which seem to be not in a
Thank you very much. I
strong
translate
position?
that under the heading of convening power. How can the World Bank Group exercise its convening power to bring this to the fore? Thank you very much. Next questioner, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Peter Edwards. I think I'm probably a real outsider. I work as a contractor for the U.S. federal government, but I'm here in my capacity as a global citizen and Caribbean national. I have a longer question on your website, which folds into some of the pointed stuff. I'll try to be brief.
Thank you.
Kind of asking a question, and it was mentioned before, how can the bank force, and I'm using that word pointedly, force your participating governments and clients to account for natural capital, into their national accounting, and again through the finance ministry, because as somebody said, the finance ministers often have the power. So what is the bank doing to, whether it's with new loans or capacity building, is there a way to kind of build upon the good work that the bank has also supported, the waves, etc., and UN accounting approaches? That's the first question. Is there kind of mechanisms to improve that? And secondly, among the other questions I'd asked, a lot of my work now is based on ocean, and ocean drives climate systems. A lot of the examples have been very terrestrial in nature. Is the bank, the word green has been used to kind of focus on more kind of terrestrial green forests, but is the bank also planning to increase or shift its focus into the ocean area and more importantly, the coastal space in the future?
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Ala Sarhan, and I'm with the Climate Change Group. Thanks to everyone, distinguished panelists. And actually, I'm not sure if this is a question or not, but the question is, how can the bank do more? I think we also should look at the client side, because it takes two to tango. So it's very important that also we have to understand the client and how they themselves, when we talk about environmental climate change, they think of global public goods, they think about, free lunches, grants, concessional financing. So it's going to be, the way I think we can frame this is some of the, what's been said before. I think Julia said, how can we connect, for example, urban air pollution with climate change? So the entry point in many cases is not to talk about climate change as such, but also to explain to them the benefits, the economic benefits accruing, to countries if they follow this route. And we used to do this by one simple example, like the cost of environmental degradation, by saying, guys, if you carry on doing this, this is where you're going to end up, business as usual. However, if we can bring in, this kind of intervention, here's how to do it. So when decision makers go to their parliaments and say, we want to get this loan because we're doing this, at least they can show some figures, they can show some economic benefits, because they usually look at financial rates of return, which don't tell much, especially when we talk about the environment. Still, I've worked in my previous life for 3 different governments, not to mention where they are, but when I used to have lots of hair, and they still think, many of them, that having a tree, if you cut it down, it's reflected in the GDP. When but all the ecological benefits, they're not counted in the GDP. So some of the folks that we have to deal with on the ground, we need to maybe do a little bit more to empower them and make them, more driven towards the bigger cause, which is how can they, how they can take on board some of the environmental sustainability issues. So I think we need to be, to be engaged more in policy dialogue and use some of the tools that we have to be able to bring them more on our side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we take one extra one now that you are queuing? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Very short, and it's for Julia. 3 days ago, we launched the environmental and social framework. Do you think that will help us move those numbers if AG took the survey 5 years from now?
Thank you very much. So we have a very interesting set of questions. One on how best to utilize convening power, how we convince governments to use better national accounting approaches, an issue of scope in terms of oceans and coastal degradation. What is the bank going to do on that? And then client-side links, how do we go beyond quantitative estimates and be able to show best practice in order to improve the policy dialogue that we have with governments. My take, and of course the framework, the last question that came from you, my take is that the implementation of the framework is going to make a difference. Yes. That's why. My take is most of the questions are addressed to our colleagues from the World Bank Group, but please, if you want to chip in, go ahead.
You guys tell me what to say.
No, I'm not going to. I mean, a little bit about what the role of the World Bank can be in this political environment. I mean, I do think that's a really good question, because I do think that compared to 2-3 years ago, much stronger headwinds, right, in many countries, given the kind of transitions we've been seeing around the world. I do think that there is incredible value in the narrative and the evidence base that the bank can bring to bear on these issues. So helping convey a story about how the urban transition makes good sense to tackle poverty, to improve livelihoods, to create a better environment, quality of life, is, and may also have climate co-benefits, is an important narrative. There is important evidence base. So I think there's a real big piece there that I think the bank can do. The other thing is, the bank can very much lead by example. And by example, these iconic projects that the bank does do, I think, have important demonstration effects within country. But I do think that they also can, if well done, inform what other MDBs do, but also DFIs more broadly. There's just so much more capital flowing now from various institutions around the world. I know the bank has been trying to do this, but can it invest a little bit more in that? I think this point about how you talk to a client, I think we have all been trying to say the same thing, which is that you kind of meet the client where they are in terms of the priorities that they see as most important. But often in tackling kind of the design of a city, in tackling transportation within a city, in tackling air quality in a city, that there can be other co-benefits associated with that. Now, those circles of what might make most sense in a city and what might make most sense for the global commons, those circles overlap, but they're not one and the same. And I think the challenge that we have is that both circles have to be addressed completely. There is both the need to be completely responsive to the domestic priorities, but at times that will get you part of the way, but maybe not all the way in dealing with some of the global commons challenges. But given the urgency, the threshold, I think that's just an important issue. There's just one other small point I want to make is just when we talk a lot about this, I think the other kind of political trend that I see is quite serious and is the closing of civic space in so many of these countries. The space for public engagement, the transparency, the engagement, the ability to hold actors to account is shrinking all around the world. Civicus does an annual report. They look at kind of fundamental violations of civic space. The trend lines are going the wrong direction. It's hard for me to see. We've been talking largely about kind of the environment and kind of growth or economics or poverty, but that issue of kind of the social dimension, the ability to hold actors to account, that's a really important space as well to protect. I'd love to see the bank actually get more serious about its work in that space as well.
Thank you, Manish. Anyone else wants to take on?
Yes, and the environmental and social framework of the bank. I think that it's very important to talk about how are we going to manage these environmental and social risks of all the activities of the bank. But sometimes when you get into any of these ministers, the finance ministry or the agriculture minister or whatever, or the industrial minister, and you talk only about risks, then you get them turned off, no? Because they say, okay, more problems, so what are we going to do about this? Probably it would be much more sellable and getting more attention from the governments if we talk about managing risks and opportunities, no? In terms of, okay, there are some things to, not only that we have to manage, just to not to have an environmental cost, etc., but probably with a trade-off on what the program they wanted to deliver or to, but at the same time, for example, there are many new issues for our governments, like, for example, the circular economy principles, the formation of human capital and knowledge exchange in these areas, the adoption of clean technologies that are not under forefront of their principal priorities, but that I think that the bank could try to show them all the opportunities that they can derive from that. And also in the national accounts and the environmental national accounts, we have been implementing them with Danny, and they really are terrorizing. No, they really, yes. One of the results was that in 1 year we have larger depletion of natural resources than the whole growth of GDP. No, so we can have natural depletion, depletion of natural resources of 3% a year, while we are growing more or less at that rate. So definitely that's not something that is sustainable. Unfortunately, the same government have not made sufficiently visible to all society this problem, and probably with some help of our donors in that area, in our financiers in that area, that could make we can become much more conscious and aware of that impact.
Thank you.
I think most of the questions are for Julia, anyways. But I'll say one thing, because it resonated to me with some of the comments that came across now. How do we focus the government's attention on the subject and on the challenge? And often enough, again, unless there are financial, economic incentives, the governments tend to look the other way. They have other things to prioritize, because they do the environmental sustainability matters take a long time to implement. You need good, successful examples. So I think the success stories and ideally those that can be replicated, and then one of the roles of the World Bank Group is to be able to tell some of our client countries what works in one place versus another, and basically create a little bit momentum around some of those topics. And for us, one of the successful recent stories over the past year is this whole notion of scaling solar in Africa. And how do you actually, bring attention to creating public-private partnerships to resolving a, energy challenge in the various places? And one can replicate that approach for many different things. Could be water utilities, could be different other, ways to more efficiently use resources in various parts of the world. And then how do you then explain to the governments that by bringing private sector solutions to those kinds of challenges, you can actually both save money and then reach some kind of a higher level of, compliance or achievement in terms of use of natural resources. And it works in many other places, but frankly, it does require a lot of boots on the ground and explaining and creating capacity in some of our countries' governance.
Very good. Do you want to add anything, Julie, or you have?
I disagree with everything everyone said. I mean, the only thing I would say is that some of these things are so big that the institution has many other priorities as well. I, of course, think this should be one of the top priorities, but there are other priorities, and I just think that it's reckless to launch something half-heartedly. Like, we should only do it if we're really going to be serious about it. I mean, the idea of a balance sheet for countries, we have a profit and loss, let's have a balance sheet for countries, is so appealing. But it would take, it's a generational issue. It would take a long time and a lot of effort to make it work properly. And so I think that our role is to kind of encourage that to happen and engage in this process. But I don't think that we don't want to be pushing on an open door. In terms of the ESF, again, it could be, and it should be, and I hope it is. There is a risk that it becomes if we implement it as it is intended, as a judgment-based process where we free up our resources on the low-risk projects to be able to concentrate on having a big impact on the high-risk projects, that would be fantastic. If it just means we default to increasing risk aversion, then it's likely to be a problem and there'll be a backlash against it. So I think making sure that we apply it in the way it is intended as a judgment-based process where we do not over-prescribe in the low-risk projects, that should help. In terms of blue, yes, we're going blue, wherever the blue goes. There you are.
Very good. So thank you very much. We are almost there, but we still have a few minutes, and I would like to take, I'm not going to take any more questions for the sorry, it's just that I want to thank everybody who submitted questions online, and I want to pick up one of them which covers an area that we haven't touched yet, and still all the trade-offs that we have been discussing in terms of opportunity cost, decision-making, institutional capacity plays out very well, and that is that how should the World Bank Group be seeking to improve its environmental performance or promote environmental in low-income countries. In low-income countries, there are a number of trade-offs that are more acute than in other countries. And judging from the assessment that we have produced, it doesn't look good. Maybe it's because the World Bank Group has better traction in middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, but clearly the poverty and the environmental challenges associated with poverty are very prominent in low-income countries. So, your words of wisdom on this one? Any reactions?
I will take some risk here, but no, but I think that probably in low-income countries, the opportunities to develop new economic green sectors that are new, that could generate a lot of, for example, agro-industrial products that are organic or that are ecological, and in those terms they can open new markets for their countries and new income for their farmers. Probably there are in all the generation of biomass in Africa, in certain low-income countries in Latin America, then definitely there's a huge opportunity to generate wealth and to generate prosperity using green growth. So probably I would focus in that area.
Maybe to build on that, a good point. I mean, I think with low-income countries, you may, when you think a little bit about urbanization, and you think about where urbanization will really focus over the next 20 years, much of that is in South Asia and particularly Africa, low-income countries. When you think about the future of energy, again, I think low-income countries aren't necessarily saddled with 20th century infrastructure and can kind of rethink how to develop energy infrastructure, perhaps in a more distributed, renewable. So having a little bit of space in which to think about what the right infrastructure business models are for these key economic systems is an opportunity. I think on the flip side, I think the one thing is just looking and monitoring and being mindful of fragility. Not only political fragility, but ecological fragility in low-income countries, and how one plans to respond, prepare, prevent that type of fragility from spilling over into something even more serious is an important thing to look at.
Thank you.
So for me, very quickly, I think we have to be also cognizant of one of the reasons why the focus on environment in some of the middle income and higher income countries has gone so much faster and so much more effectively. It's around capacity. So to what extent, whether it's through policy dialogue, policy guidance, boots on the ground, consulting bundled with investment work, we can actually support the lower income countries in developing their capacity to deal with regulations which are complex and high standard, and to what extent they can work on the governance, on procurement. There are so many different things that are tougher to do in those countries which relate to environmental technologies and other things that we kind of look to have implemented in the projects that are expected to have those benefits. I mean, we need to be open about it, and ultimately, part of the focus of the strategy of the bank group now is on low-income countries, on FCS, and how do we utilize the capital increase from the shareholders, that vote of confidence, to actually strengthen over there, right?
Julia, you have the last word.
Oh, I like that. The big opportunity actually of the ESF is here, I think, because what we need is country systems that work for the ESF to work properly. And if we invest in strengthening the country systems, we can do the capacity improvement. I think what Aggie said at the beginning, that environment projects are hard, I think that's true. They are hard. They don't tend to be very large in terms of volumes of dollars, and they tend to be high in terms of attention that you have to spend per dollar lent, and that is fundamentally an issue. But if we were to do the kind of in strengthening the capacity as part of strengthening the borrower framework, you would have multiple benefits beyond just the individual projects of the bank.
Thank you so much. I think you have given us a lot of food for thought covering all these questions. I want to thank all the audience for being here, those here present and those online, all the colleagues who have made this launch event possible. And you, audience, for spending the last hour and a half with us, but especially our panel members, and I will ask you to join me in a show of hands for them. And without further ado, I declare this panel discussion closed. Thank you very much.